Good morning, people of Connecticut. My name is Mark Fitch. I am Senior Investigative Reporter for Connecticut Inside Investigator, and I am joined by my colleague, Catherine Revelo, and we are here to discuss the big stories this week that we've published on Inside Investigator and kind of do a little catch up on what's going on. We're filling in for our managing editor, Connor, who is taking a couple needed days off. And hey, let's get into it. How are you doing this morning, Catherine?
I'm doing pretty good, Mark. How are you?
I am all wired up on caffeine and
That
shivering
is
in
the
the small
way to
apartment.
be on a Thursday morning after an 11-hour or however long it was legislative session.
Well, we're going to get into that.
Yeah, but first, we had Veterans Day this week, and Mark, your latest investigation is about the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Yes, I mean, it wasn't the most pleasant story to write, I have to be honest. But it involves disciplinary issues at the Department of Veterans Affairs in Rocky Hill, Connecticut here. And I had submitted a Freedom of Information request, and really this story was born out of another story that I did over the summer. I wrote about the former security director at Veteran Affairs, a guy named Steve Scatina, and he was forced out of his job on a kind of garbage ethics complaint. Um, he made the horrible choice of asking one of the maintenance guys whether they wanted to do some side work for him at his house, for which he paid them, and somehow that bred an ethics complaint that was ultimately dismissed, but the department forced him out anyway. So we did this story in over the summer, and we got so many comments on that story from people who were obviously working for the department and obviously had a lot of inside knowledge about what was going on. It became, I remember I would sit there and talk with Connor, like, what is going on at the Department of Veterans Affairs? And so finally I filed a Freedom of Information request to find out. And, I searched for all, investigations that resulted in discipline, things like that. And I got back, some disturbing things. People drinking on the job, people doing drugs on the job, stealing, a defrocked priest, essentially, like still performing services. It was, yeah, it's not exactly the story you want to release, during the week of, Veterans Day, but, hopefully a story that gets people to maybe fly a little straighter over there. It was a difficult story to write, I have to be honest.
Yeah, I mean it's really detailed. There's just an incredible the number of investigations that were opened, I think is really incredible. And right, the number of findings that were unsubstantiated too, right? I mean, there's very clearly a lot of wrongdoing going on here, but as you discuss in the story, it also seems like the management in the Department of Veterans Affairs is also potentially selectively targeting people and using these investigations to punish people who are disfavored and then give other people who are a little more in their graces a pass.
Yeah, it was kind of twofold. Now, I had numerous off the record conversations with both past and present employees at the Department of Veteran Affairs, and that is the story that I was told. That, essentially, it was particularly under the management or what have you of the former Deputy Commissioner Joe DeNeo and an HR director, Beth Ann Watts. People felt that they are being unfairly targeted, uh, you know, for minor things, and then major things were often either swept under the rug or not actually disciplined. Um, you know, uh, a lot of times those cases involved employees who had union representation. So it's not like you can, when an employee has union representation, you can't just fire them. It's not the same as when a director comes under investigation or something like that who doesn't have union representation. But there were some instances where it looked like some stuff was not being followed through on, or that somebody was thumbing the scale to get these guys off the hook. One instance involved numerous liquor bottles and marijuana found at a workstation on premises. That guy received a 5-day suspension, but two other instances of him misusing a state vehicle went unpunished and, essentially unnoticed. Like, I didn't even get those investigations because they didn't involve discipline. And it was that same person who turned the tables and filed this, ethics complaint against the former security director. So there was a lot of infighting going on. And it did appear in some instances that somebody was, somebody higher up was putting their thumb on the scales of what an investigation could uncover or what kind of discipline was going to be handed out.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the examples you mentioned in there was employees who worked for the food services department who were essentially taking time off under the Family Medical Leave Act to go drive for Uber, which is not an appropriate use of the Family Medical Leave Act, which then leaves that department understaffed. And that's one of the issues you address in the investigation is, this is a department that ran a deficit last year and now is short staffed and has to pay extra for overtime or to bring additional people in.
Yes, I did talk to the former food services director. He was also forced out under an ethics complaint. Essentially, and he had gone to HR saying, "Hey, look, there's a bunch of my employees are taking FMLA time, and I have evidence that they're using that time to work second jobs." Nothing was really done about it. Instead, he had an investigation opened into him, claiming that he was working a second job when he was supposed to be teleworking at home. So, and that ended up getting him pushed out, and ethics violation settlement that he had to, he had to reach with the state ethics commission. So, there was a lot of back and forth going on there, and yeah, in some instances it seemed like we're going to ignore certain problems that we don't think we can really fix because they're represented by unions, and we're going to go after people who are complaining. And to your point too, as far as like they ran a deficit, they did run a $1 million operations deficit last year, but they've also seen about a 30% increase in overtime spending. And that happens when people are out on leave all the time, when there's 80 plus days of suspension because of these disciplinary actions, plus the paid administrative leave that people are on pending the investigations. So that can take, a month, 2 months, whatever. They're getting paid the entire time, and they're not allowed on campus. So you have to have someone come fill in. And then, in one of the instances I outlined in the story, this one guy was late for work 83 times. Somebody has to cover you when you're late. So like these are essential positions. So and he's still going. He's still there, having a good time. Hopefully getting there on time. But yeah, eventually they just gave him a different shift. So it does seem like they can, for what's essentially like a military department, they could use a little stricter discipline, that you would expect from veterans and, military personnel.
Right. And I mean, we're not talking just about like a regular, government office building here. We're talking about also, what is essentially, a care home for veterans too. So, the impact of people who are not showing up for shifts and things like that is also that, people who need medical care or other attention are not receiving it.
Yeah, you have, and like that was one of the issues. One of the personal care attendants, the nursing aides, was using marijuana while at work taking care of veteran patients. So that's a problem. And also on campus you have they're housing veterans who may be having housing issues, things like that. This really isn't the place to be having these internecine fights, between personnel, and not having a strong, disciplinary code to take care of these veterans. So
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Nope, that's all right. I was gonna say, right, you mentioned that this story was born out of comments out of a previous story that you reported, and right, and that's still amazing to me because we often get reaction from people after we publish something, but it's an email or a phone call because they're mad at us or because they want to add additional context, right? The fighting that was going on in this story, also in the comment section of this current investigation, one of the people who you mentioned in the investigation who was fired for abusing state property and for essentially misusing a state car is in the comment section of this story, still going on a tirade.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of swinging back and forth there. It's war against everybody apparently in the comments section. So yeah, everybody's going back there to have it out. Fine, get it out of your system there. Don't get it out of your system at Department of Veterans Affairs, where there are also these numerous hostile work environment, fights, things like that. Some of these things didn't even make it into my FOI request because they were just kind of swept under the rug or didn't get the full investigation treatment. But I know they happened. I talked to people, and you know, it's not a great reflection on the department, and perhaps it needs a little bit of a come to Jesus moment, essentially.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, and we're talking about on average like 10 complaints a year that your FOI turned back. So if there's additional stuff that's going on too, I mean, that's a pretty big scale of issues that are going on in this department.
For a small department, too. Yeah,
Yeah.
not a ton of people there. So speaking of come to Jesus moments, we had a special session, or we're in the middle of a special session, and Catherine, you had the opportunity, I guess, or the joy of watching the House session yesterday. What can you tell us about it?
Well, it was it got a little bit ugly. There were four different bills that are part of this special session. One of them is the $500 million um, rainy day fund deposit, which goes over the 18% cap on the rainy day funds. But is to specifically be used between now and when the legislature reconvenes in February. And the impetus for that is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or HR1, that Congress passed to address federal funding cuts and other changes to programs, and to give the governor's office the ability to react quickly to that. We have a revision of the housing bill, which was controversial when it was passed by the legislature last session and when Governor Lamont vetoed it. And that was certainly no less controversial yesterday. Republicans came out very angry about the way that had been handled. It had been sold as being a bipartisan bill, but according to Republicans, they didn't get to see it until it went live on the legislature's website about an hour before the session started. And as a matter of fact, when they began talking about it yesterday, the fiscal analysis wasn't even in yet. So there was a weird little moment where they kind of had to pause and wait and figure out what to do while the fiscal analysis came in. There's the third bill, which is for Yukon Health to purchase Waterbury Hospital. And then the fourth bill is kind of a catch-all bill, which has a bunch of stuff in it. There's a bunch of stuff for behavioral health care for children. There's what's being called an expansion of the Trust Act, which is really just codifying changes that the Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court made earlier this year that kind of ban ICE from coming into courthouses for immigration detainers and arrests, and ban them wearing masks in courthouses. And there's a couple of other things thrown in that bills too, which didn't make it through final passage last session.
There's a couple things going on here with this special session. Let's start first with the stuff meant to address the federal government and whatever cuts there are. Now, federal government just reopened about probably about 3 hours before they passed this bill in the House.
Yeah.
I mean, is that going to have any kind of effect, or was it maybe a little premature to set aside all this 500 million that the governor kind of has at his disposal now?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the argument that Republicans were making, especially now that, SNAP is not only funded by the state this month, but will be permanently funded moving forward until the end of the fiscal year in Washington. So, that's their argument is there's no need to do this. There's no need to set this money aside. And Democrats' answer this is, well, this was never about the shutdown. This was about HR1 and the changes that came through to that, especially in Medicaid.
Gotcha. So there was a pretty big Medicaid hole that had to be filled, and they expected it to get bigger because of HR1. So, okay, and I mean, is that that 500 million that would normally go to paying down the pensions?
I'm not sure about that, actually.
Okay, yeah, because generally, if the rainy day fund is full, any surplus goes to pay down the pension debt. So, and there's some returns there. Let's get to the housing bill, though. I mean, obviously, this was passed during regular session last year. Governor Lamont vetoed it, saying he wanted the municipalities to have more input. Um, why was this necessary in a special session, do you think?
Well, the argument that Democrats have been making, I think, is that, the housing crisis exists and that waiting until the next session to do that isn't soon enough, and that the sooner this bill gets passed, the sooner the changes can be implemented. Whether or not, it meets the definition of what needs to be done in the special session, I think is a little bit more debatable. Again, Republicans are certainly making the point that it is not worthy of a special session. They're making the point that, while many portions of the bill were part of the housing bill from last session, there are other new parts that didn't get a special hearing, that didn't, or excuse me, not a special hearing, a public hearing, didn't get any kind of public input on it. And, because these are pretty sweeping changes for municipalities, they feel that there should be more public input and it doesn't rise to the level of having emergency action.
Yeah, and I recall some just out of a purely political hypothesis here. I do recall that the Connecticut Mirror got a hold of Governor Lamont's text messages and emails regarding his housing veto, and a lot of it seemed to be politically motivated, worrying that perhaps passing the bill could hurt not only him but Democrats in general during elections. And hey, governor's up for re-election next year. The earlier housing bill is passed, the more time allows for people to forget that it was passed. Before they get to the voting booths. So there might be some political considerations in there as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't be I wouldn't be surprised, right? I mean, the fair share portion of the bill, I think, has been fairly controversial. I don't see that going away anytime soon, particularly as this bill rolls out and we see, right now all this is hypothetical. Once the bill gets implemented and we see what the real world implications of it, and if there are knock-on consequences or things that the bill does that weren't intended, all that's going to play out too.
Okay. Well, for anybody paying attention at home, the those bills are now in the hands of the Senate, and we'll be watching that today. Um, anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today, Catherine?
No, I don't think so, other than head on over to insideinvestigator.org and check out our coverage. Our poor colleague, Alex Appel, I think her story came in at midnight last night, right after the House
Did
session wrapped. So go read that so that she had a good reason to stay up that late.
absolutely. And hey, leave some comments. Maybe we'll do a story on them. Until then, good luck and stay safe. And I can't remember what Connor's exact sign off is. Oh, stay safe, stay informed, and goodbye.